This video is brought to you by Blessed Be God Boutique, maker of Catholic fashionable apparel, handmade accessories, and more. I had a priest contact me this weekend through Patreon. He was describing this parish closures story in Baltimore from a different angle than I covered it in my live stream this past week. In that story, maybe you may know that the bishop has consolidated and closed down from 61 parishes to 21 in his whole diocese. That's a rather large number to pare down. 21 parishes. Some of the plan that was released and used the language of market economics to not only describe their reasoning for doing so, which one could understand using that kind of language, but also the role the surviving parishes will use in the community. One-stop shopping kind of places was the language in one part of that report. It was very strange to read coming from a bishop of the Catholic Church. If we were talking about the CEO of Burger King saying such a thing about needing to downsize the number of their restaurants in a metropolitan area, that would make sense. But when talking about the church founded by Jesus Christ on the Rock of Peter, and to describe sacraments and access to them as one-stop shopping, you begin to wonder what's going on. The term the priest used in his communication to me was that priests quietly describe this as managed decline, that the church is in a state of managed decline right now, and that many of the bishops, the more moderate ones who keep their heads down, who look at their job as managing this decline of the church into the new reality will be when stability finally takes hold. It seems to me that there's a major assumption in their reasoning, and that there will be a new reality that is in some way positive, that instead of this managed decline leading to essentially a total collapse of belief and a tiny remnant remaining when it's finally done. Of course, some in the comments I'm sure will say that we are already there, but we'll leave that assumption to you if that is your position on it. For now, we have this story coming out of Europe of the collapse in vocations. We have some startling new numbers here about collapse in vocations, but also collapse in the number of new Catholics entering the church. So for the story, we go to Info Catholica with this headline: Priests and seminarians continue to decline under Pope Francis. The Vatican Statistical Yearbook reveals an increase of 14 million baptized Catholics worldwide, although the number of priests and seminarians continues to decline. 14 million new Catholics sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Until you realize we're talking about a church that is ostensibly on paper 1.2 or 1.3 billion Catholics worldwide. 14 million new Catholics is not a good number, because you almost certainly had that many who went to their particular judgment last year, just by a matter of old age and other factors. So when you start factoring those kinds of things, and 14 million new Catholics isn't actually that good of a number. But you also have now fewer seminarians and fewer priests than before. There has been a steady decline in vocations going back, as it turns out, to 1999. And if you're actually familiar with the broader statistics since the Second Vatican Council, the number of priests, the number of seminarians, the number of vocations has been in decline pretty consistently since the late 1960s, since the implementation of the new Mass, specifically, when many priests simply left the priesthood on principle once that was issued. But we're seeing this acceleration, really, of the decline of vocations. And over all of this looms the Synod on Synodality. Remember, they talk about putting the laity in charge of things. In Germany, they want laity giving homilies and reading the gospel. They want laity managing parishes. The Vatican is thinking more of greater laity role in the archdiocesan offices and the chanceries and in the Vatican itself, but there's still talk of laity managing parishes as well. This is the Vatican's way of combating the collapse in vocations. Not in doing things to foster vocations, but in finding ways to keep services running, this time in the hands of the laity. Let's go to the article. Quote, There are 14 million more baptized Catholics around the world, according to the latest annual figures released by the Holy See earlier this month, while the number of priests and seminarians has continued a decline that began in 2012. Published in early April, the Vatican Statistical Yearbook presents data on the global state of the Catholic Church as of the end of 2022, the most recent year for which data is collected. While the number of Catholics in general has grown, the number of priests, seminarians, and religious has decreased, and in some places by quite significant margins. The data is considerably less detailed than that published last year. As L'Osservatore Romano, the Vatican's internal newspaper, points out, in 2022 there will be about 14 million more baptized Catholics than in 2021, and the figure will rise from 1.37 million in 2021 to 1.39 million in 2022. For context, demographic data suggests a global population of 7.97 million people by the end of 2022. Following the path marked in previous years, the growth in the number of Catholics was observed especially in Africa. The continent saw a 3% increase in the number of Catholics, rising from 265 million to 273 million. This figure is slightly lower than the 3.1% growth recorded in Africa, according to the 2021 Statistical Yearbook. The number of Catholics also grew slightly in America and Asia. Although the yearbook did not give specific figures, it reported a growth of 0.9% and 0.6% respectively. On the other hand, the data for Europe and Oceania were, according to L'Osservatore Romano, simply stable without giving figures. End quote. Where the bishops and the priests defend the faith, there seems to be growth. Fiducia Supplicans just being the latest example of this, the bishops there largely said no to that obviously evil document. Where they play footsie with the world, where they get close to secularism, where they embrace secular thinking, where they refuse to stand up against the rising tide of evil in the world, there's no growth, or barely growth. Again, depending on how honest the reporting is of numbers. Now, I want to mention as an aside, those numbers are talking about 2021 and 2022. It takes years to compile census data. It does. And then to get it into the hands of the various social science organizations who tend to report these things. That's why they're dealing with 2- and 3-year-old data. It literally takes years to compile this stuff, especially when we're talking about worldwide data and the number of Catholics and catechumens and things in Africa and large continents like that. But the trend is pretty unmistakable. There's growth, but it's slower than the general population growth of human beings more broadly. It's not a good sign. You would think that at least the growth would be parallel, that it'd be at about the same rate. That would be what we would call a sustainable amount of growth. At the very least, you want something better than sustainable in terms of Catholics, right? You want more Catholics. You want the world being converted. And these numbers reflect that the world's not really being converted to the Catholic faith. But of all the places in the world, Africa seems to be the healthiest. It's not really surprising anybody, even though when you dig deeper into the numbers, it's not as healthy as this picture is painting for you. But in general, that's where the growth is. But how about vocations? This is where the rubber meets the road, folks. Without teachers of the faith, we're in a lot of trouble. Without those who can confect the sacraments, we have a lot of trouble. Quote, while the number of Catholics in general has grown around the world, such a trend has not been reflected in the Catholic clergy. L'Osservatore Romano reported that in 2022, there were only 13 more bishops than in 2021, meaning a total of 5,351. As for priests, the number ordained continued to decline, this time by 142, bringing the total to 407,730. The decline in seminarians accelerates under Pope Francis. Crucially linked to priest data is the number of seminarians currently in training around the world. At the end of 2022, there were 108,481 seminarians in the Church, which represents a decrease of 1.3% compared to the previous year's figure, which was 109,895. Africa has the largest proportion of total seminarians in the Church, some 34,541. They are followed by Asia with 31,767, America with 27,738, Europe with about 14,461, and Oceania with 974. Once again, as in 2021, this figure is the lowest number of seminarians since 1999. When presenting the 2021 figures last year, the Vatican stated that, quote, the trend in the number of seminarians observed in the world as of 2013 denotes an uninterrupted decline that continues in 2021. This time, the Vatican described it as the continuation of a, quote, decline that has characterized the trend in priestly vocation since 2012. In fact, the downward trend has been marked since just before the beginning of Pope Francis's pontificate and has worsened notably throughout his mandate. There were 120,616 seminarians in 2011 and 120,051 in 2012. At the end of 2013, there were 118,251, which represents a decrease of 1,800 in 1 year. That decline accelerated with the arrival of Francisco, with a drop to 116,939 the following year. But as with the overall number of Catholics, certain parts of the world have been affected differently. Africa once again saw a 2.1% increase from the previous year. Oceania also recorded a 1.3% growth in seminarians compared to the previous year. However, in Europe, America, and Asia, there was a significant and continued decline in vocations. In Europe, the number of seminarians fell by 6% compared to the previous year, and in America and Asia by 3.2% and 1.2%, respectively. End quote. That's a lot of numbers, but it just means that the church is, quote, growing in the, quote, peripheries. That's all it really means. Again, managed decline. This is the Francis effect. This is the post-conciliar Vatican II effect, and this is the effect of the church not standing up against secular morality, embracing things like the James Martin sin, waffling really with public unrepentant sinners who hold high political office, who defend the Moloch ritual and other unprecedented evils. This is the effect of that. When the morality of the church is indistinguishable from the morality of a clearly fallen world, this is the effect. Now, that report goes on to say the only place you get growth in vocations is in the, no one will be surprised by this, the permanent diaconate. That you have continued falling of vocations to the religious life. Nuns, monks, you get the idea. The church needs more religious in addition to priests. The one thing we probably don't need more of are, frankly, permanent deacons. And that's not a slight against anybody watching this who's in the permanent diaconate. It's the one place where there's growth. And I'd like to know why that is. I've seen some theories, but I'd really like to know, why is it the permanent diaconate grows and nothing else in the church seems to? Curious what you think about this, so let me know in the comments, please. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And if you've ever thought about supporting the work that we do here at Return to Tradition, there are links in the description box below to Patreon, Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and other options, all of which have been asked for by viewers. Your support does help keep these daily messages coming, and I thank you for them. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.